Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 96 today, as we close in on triple digits of episodes. So Maggie and I decided to do a little diversion and finally get around to something that I know that Maggie has wanted to talk about for a long time, and which was suggested to us recently. So we wanted to mix it up a little bit and talk about Rogue One as an adaptation. It's a fascinating kind of example of thinking about adaptation and the relation of one work to other works and things. And also a really good movie. I think it's, I mean, certainly in the modern Star Wars films, feature films, I think it's clearly the best of all of the modern feature films. Really, really good.
Fully agree.
Yeah. But first, before we dig too deep, I wanna just do a really quick announcement. To remind folks who haven't had the opportunity to check out our new Signum store and collaboratory, our newly revised store and collaboratory, where you can find lots of things. So, for instance, you can find the recordings of Amy Sturgis's Exploring Star Trek class, which is a real deep dive, a full semester of lectures into the entire Star Trek world, with Amy Sturgis, who's an amazing lecturer. So you can purchase the recordings here in the store. You can purchase them and download them, or if you would like instead, you can just subscribe to the collaboratory and get full access. If I click on lectures here, there it is. You can listen to all the lectures here within the collaboratory, to this, and to look at all these other classes that are already on here as well. The lecture sets which you can listen to, including, for instance, this collaborative one between Amy Sturgis, Gabriel Schenk, and Maggie Parke on Lovecraft, for instance.
That was good. That was really fun.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, so again, the way that this works, it's very simple. For folks who would like to just purchase a thing and download the files to your computer, you can do that here at the Signum store. If you go to the collaboratory, then you can, then you're subscribing monthly for a low monthly cost. It starts at $9 a month, and you can get access to all the stuff, and you can listen to anything and also read other stuff. Like, for instance, I just released a new chapter of my book recently. Okay, no, wait. I finished it, but it's not released yet. It's going to be released here in the next week or two. So this is my new Lord of the Rings book, and there's bunches of other stuff, like the really awesome Silmarillion primer that Jeff LaSala is writing. All this stuff here. So you can find those things like that are works in progress. And of course, there's some really fun studio stuff that's in progress as well. If you, when you join the collab, when you subscribe, you not only get access to our finished stuff that's in the library, and I say finished, again, I'm releasing the finished chapters, chapter by chapter, but it's not until the whole book is published that it's going to go out for sale in the store. But you can read the chapters as I go, as all those books unfold. And we've got some fun studios projects happening there too.
Yeah, and the best part of that with Collaboratory has been like the participation from people. So you can sign up as a member, and if you join like a creator circle, like Nubeta has a creator circle, if you're familiar with him. And so like monthly he'll come on and chat for like an hour, and we'll look at a recent clip, we'll talk about how it looks, we'll think about the music, we'll think about the visuals, see where the art goes in. It'd be cooler if we could zoom in here, it'd be great if the title was up here, and it should look more like spray paint. And so it becomes this very like participatory group thing to get feedback. And if you're not in a circle, you can still do that like in the clips, because we'll post clips, one or two a month generally, of new edits, and then we'll take notes under that of like, oh, I like this, but that was a bit short, or it'd be really cool if you could also add a little bit here. So it becomes very much a group effort to kind of develop these ideas, but you get to be part of the process, which is super fun. And we're certainly enjoying that part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, so the Collaboratory is not only a subscription service where you get access to the material for a subscription price instead of purchasing each one, but also enables you to be involved in some of the ways that Maggie was just describing. That's why it's called the Collaboratory, and that is part of the fun there. So do check that out at collaboratory.signumuniversity.org/plaza. You can see both options there. All right, so we want to talk about Rogue One.
Rogue One. First of all, this is from James Nonaman as one of the War of the Rohirrim backer rewards. So
Yes.
he actually nominated two and chose Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So James, you're getting a double header here, but we couldn't wait. We're like, yes,
Which is
please,
what you
let's.
get when you nominate two things we've been waiting to talk about for a
I
long
want to
time.
talk about both of them.
Yes,
Yeah. And we will
exactly.
get back to Narnia next week. We were talking about going back to Narnia, and there's still three other backer recommendations, which I'm going to reveal here because I feel like we should build the excitement. Nosferatu, which I haven't even seen yet,
The
which
new
I'm quite
one, yeah,
excited
yeah,
about.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's going to be a lot of fun.
That's just because that's both an adaptation of the original Nosferatu film, and of course an adaptation of the book as well. So
Right,
yeah,
right. So that's like a double header, which I love when people do that. Another one is Last Unicorn. Love.
yes,
I think that would be a lot of fun.
yes,
And the last one is Anne of Green Gables.
yep, yep.
So I'm on board. I'm on
Yeah.
board with all of these.
Yeah, exactly. Maggie was giving me this list, and I was like, "Oh man, twist, twist!" Like these are not going to be chores.
No, these will be fun.
Yeah,
So we will get back to Narnia next week. We said we would continue with Prince Caspian, but we wanted to dip into Rogue One because we were excited about it.
yeah, exactly.
And Rogue One's kind of a funny one because it's not actually an adaptation. It's not based on a previous work, but it is based on a previous world. It does fill in a gap. It's a really interesting development story and process. And then since it's come out, it was adapted into a graphic novel. So we have kind of like a reverse adaptation, which
Right.
I just think this is going to be real fun to talk about. And I just think as a film, it is beautiful. It's such a great story.
As David Pirtle says, we also got Andor, which is basically Rogue Zero, as he says.
And
Yeah,
we have to talk about Andor too. Like it's so good.
it's so
And
good.
season 2 is about to come out, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't handle all of it.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about that as I was rewatching Rogue One. I'm like, oh man, I got to rewatch the first
I
season
need
of
to rewatch
Andor,
Andor.
so I always do that, which is why I follow these things in chunks.
Yeah.
I tend to. But like I didn't get around to seeing Andor for like a year and a half after it dropped because I was like, no, I gotta wait until I do my Star Wars thing, and then I'll watch them all through, and then I'll be ready for it. But
Yeah. Fair enough.
yeah. Anyway, but it's okay. So let's talk about this. Like, so first, let's address this question of like adaptation, because I do think. I mean, one of the things that we've seen is that the boundaries of what is just as the sort of expectations, when you take the really simplistic concepts that a lot of people still have of like what the relationship is between a book and a film adaptation, right? You know, and there's this very false, enormously oversimplified, like the job of the film is to take the book and put it on screen. And it's like, you know, as we've talked about many times, like let us count the ways in which that is a misunderstanding of the relationship. The more I would probably, like if you'd asked me, you know, when it came out, is this an adaptation? I would have said no, because it didn't fit my category of what an adaptation is, which is, I would have said, well, no, an adaptation is when you're taking a text and you're translating that into film, right? And there's no written text behind this. It's just interacting with other movies. So it's a movie that interacts with other movies. But of course, as we've discussed it more, I see how
The definition gets more fluid.
the definition
and
gets much more fluid,
fits
right?
in.
It's really
Yeah.
about adaptation is really about a relationship between two stories, right? You know, telling a story that is in relationship with something else. This, of course, has even helped me to recontextualize. Like, I wouldn't have used the word adaptation to describe something like the Aeneid, for instance, but I would now. Like, the Aeneid is clearly an adaptation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like, no question. Like, that is absolutely what Virgil was doing when he wrote the Aeneid, was adapting. Like, I'm going to take these traditional cornerstones of Greek culture and I'm going to do them in Latin for the Roman culture, right? And the Roman world. And then, of course, we get time and again throughout the Middle Ages, textual adaptations of other texts, right? When someone is whether it's something like back to the Aeneid, right? Something like the old French Roman d'Aeneas, which is a romance courtly love version of the Aeneid, like super weird.
I don't know that one.
Oh my goodness. Right. It was really popular. It was like a really popular novelization, almost basically, of the Aeneid. It's still in verse, but it's, whatever. Anyway, or you start getting into King Arthur, right? And the relationship between one version of the Arthur story to another and the way that they were constantly adapting. And so it's interesting because, like, this is the kind of thing, like, this is where I lived. Like, this was my home address throughout graduate school and my dissertation, and and many of the things that I loved teaching most was this kind of relationship among stories. When one story is interacting with, what Chaucer does in Troilus and Cressade with Boccaccio, with Il Filostrato, how he is and so self-consciously and so sort of delightfully. There's what Rogue One is doing in relationship with the original Star Wars movies is very similar to those. And once again, you've got somebody who's telling a story, but they're telling a story that is in self-conscious relationship with, in one sense, trying to fit in, to blend in with perfectly. Rogue One is, I think, it's an even more interesting example than many of the other new Star Wars things, because it's because of the way they specifically, like, they explicitly connect, like, the characters that we get, right? The way in which they're not just trying to tell a story from within that world, but the way that they're stitching it in to the other movies and the other stories that we have.
Yeah, because we're not just familiar with some of the characters. Like, we know some of the characters from stories before and stories after. That's great. That's very much a fill in the gap prequel,
Right.
Unanswered story. But there's also, like, ships and creatures and languages and blue milk and, like, all these other
Right.
little references that just tie it into the world, that took me back to that, the time we were discussing visions of, like, what is it that makes it a Star Wars. Well, they're very naturally pulling all those pieces together. And the fact that it sets before A New Hope, it's taking us back to earlier technology, to earlier uniforms. Like, it has to fit within certain rules and expectations, but it's also a standalone story.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you really could watch Rogue One without any other Star Wars knowledge.
Yes.
And it would make sense. It would be fine. But the fact that you could end Rogue One and start A New Hope, and they blend seamlessly into each other, chef's kiss.
It's really, yeah. I think this is a hard thing, but I think my favorite moment in Rogue One is Darth Vader's invasion into the ship at the end.
So good.
So incredible.
Do you know that whole scene is CG?
No.
That entire scene is CG, and you're like, what? Yeah, Allie and I were talking about, my husband and I were talking about that because we were watching it last night, and, like, that is one of the few moments we actually see, I'm going to swear a little bit, the badassery of Darth Vader.
Darth Vader,
you
yes.
know? Like,
yes.
We see the fear of the threat of Vader a lot, and we do have the chokehold, and we do have a few moments, but, like, his moves are so intense and so fast and powerful. Those guys have no chance of escape.
The
So it's
utter
just
helplessness.
incredible.
Yes.
And the way that's shot, having the darkness, the ominousness, it was just, and then the music starts, and then the red lightsaber.
Yeah, so good, so good, and the effect that the impact that has on the beginning of A New Hope. Like, if you do go and watch A New Hope after that, right? Like, the whole experience of,
yes, I did download this just in case.
Yes. Anyway, like it's anyway I find that is really, and it's one of the things, again, when I think about like the question of like if I were trying to defend the proposition that Rogue One is an adaptation, this is one of the things I'd say, like if it isn't a kind of dialogue with another existing known story where it like retroactively is transformative on that story, like that the very end, the desperate flight with the data upload, from Scarif, with Darth Vader right there killing people, almost getting it, and then we get the capture of Princess Leia, right? Capture and imprisonment of Princess Leia in A New Hope and everything. Not just providing context for that, but the kind of emotional weight that it now gives by reframing the beginning of that in the way. It's so cool. It's really, really interestingly done.
And when you're just watching New Hope, like it could be considered a throwaway line where it's, we got these plans at great cost.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all we hear.
Yeah.
And then you see the great cost and you learn, and the tying it to the familiarity of, having, I was going to say Jin Lasso. That's not right. Urso.
Jin Urso, yeah.
Not Lasso. Ted Lasso's
combining shows here.
Yeah. Jin Urso. Having Jin Urso's be central to it, and then his daughter being, the key motivator, but her relationship, like bringing in that human element is just a really beautiful way to tell a story. But I just love that in terms of like gap filling adaptation, that you have this one line in New Hope that none of us really thought about. And I think it was one of the art directors in a 2003 adaptation of the prequels, and it was his idea to kind of develop this, and he started pitching this way back then. If I got an idea of how to fill this gap, and I want to tell this story, and that's how we got here.
Yeah. No, it's really, really interesting. So yeah, so thinking about, adaptation, one of the things that I would say, is involved with adaptation, the idea of change in some way, right, is, I think, part of the adaptation concept. So for instance, I would, even in the examples that I was just giving of like the medieval stuff, the ancient medieval books that I was just talking about, right? All of those, they're not like media adaptations, right? They're book to book adaptations, not book to film or film to book or whatever. Right. They're book to book adaptations, but they're still adaptations in the sense that like I'm going to take this and I'm going to change it. Like I'm going to do something.
I'm going to do it again in my way.
Yeah, I'm going to do it again in my way. And even I am going to deliberately introduce changes. Like I'm going to take this very Celtic Arthur story and I'm going to make it French, right? Or I'm going to take this French story and I'm going to make it English or whatever, or German. And again, and then it's not always just like that. Like, okay, I'm not going to get into a whole lecture of what Troilus does with Il Filostrato, but anyway, like the point is, he's doing something to it. Like he's taking it and he's not just retelling it, he's transforming it. Right. And in Rogue One, on the one hand, you can see that Rogue One is in one sense trying not to transform things, right? There's a desire to kind of to conform rather than transform. Like I want this, they obviously
want it to fit in.
Want it to be a Star Wars film that feels like a Star Wars film and looks like a Star Wars film. And again, that's exactly the conversation we've had before about what does that mean and how do they capture that. But this felt to me like a different kind of story. And I was trying to put because I haven't succeeded yet in really putting my finger on
Why?
Why? Like, what
Yeah.
feel? Because this does not just feel like. I mean, yes, it is a chapter, an earlier chapter in the
Yeah.
story, but it's when I think about the relationship, for instance, between the three prequel films, and the original trilogy. Rogue One doesn't feel to me to be like of exactly equal standing in that series, if you see what I mean. It's not like we just be like, okay, so this should be episode
Right.
4, and we'll call the episode 4 episode 5 now. Like
Yeah.
it's not exactly like, it's not a full-blown episode of the Star Wars story in a
Right.
sense.
And it is a standalone, but it's not an independent, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it's like Solo. Like, they're hard to compare. And they're very different. But I think in terms of categorization, they're probably pretty similar. That they're standalone, but they're not independent. But I think that's an interesting conversation to develop a little bit more. Like, why does this one feel different? I don't have an immediate answer, but I agree with you that this one does feel different. And part of it, I think, is that there isn't a slavish duty to be part of a trilogy or
Right.
a 6 film set. There is this kind of independence that it can stand alone.
So yeah, here's the like vague, hand wavy starting point I have for the difference, and that is that it seemed to me, as I was thinking about, as I was watching Rogue One again this time, is there's a difference in priority. The Star Wars films, like the original trilogy, are so successful because you have this big story, right? The story of the rebellion and the fall of the Empire and the rediscovery of the Jedi, right? That's like the overarching story. And within that story, or in the course of telling that big story, you have individual characters that we care about, that we come to know, and we get really invested in Luke and Han and Leia and all of the other characters, and sort of personal stories along the way. And those two things are really well balanced. And that balance is not always trivial to maintain, and I'm sure we can all think of lots of examples where something has veered too far one way or the other, in balancing like the overarching plot and the individual character stories and development. But the overall trilogy, I would say, you've got the big overarching story, and subordinate to that, you have the stories of the individual characters. Rogue One seems to me to be inverted from that. This is primarily the story of people, of Jin primarily, Cassian secondarily, and in the course of like working out their personal stories, especially Jin's personal story, which from the very beginning of the film, which begins with Galen Erso and Jin, and and Lyra, and Jin is a little girl, right? And so like the opening thing is like, what happened to Galen Erso, and why does Jin's life end up the way it is, right? And then, of course, it culminates in her fulfilling her father's vision, right? It's, so the overarching story in Rogue One, the dominant story of Rogue One, is the personal story of her and her journey and her character's development. But it's like along the way of doing that arc of her story, part of the larger plot of the rebellion and the fall of the Empire was also moved forward, but that's not the point of it, right? That's not the purpose of it. Whereas again, I feel like it's the other way around in the original Star Wars films, where the whole story is the story of, the Empire and the rebellion and the rediscovery of the Jedi. And anytime you state things in this kind of form, I mean, I'm sure all of us can think of 100, sort of counter examples, and a lot of people might be being like, well, what are you talking about? It's A New Hope starts with, Luke at his aunt and uncle's farm, and it's the whole hero's journey. It's like, it's all about Luke and Luke's journey. But again, I don't think that that's true in the same way. I think that I'm not in any way trying to say the development of the characters aren't important in the original Star Wars trilogy. But although Luke's own character development does drive a great deal of the larger arc of how that story develops, the original Star Wars trilogy is not the Luke Skywalker story in the same way that Rogue One is the Jyn Erso story. I mean,
Yeah.
I just that seems to me fairly clear, and so this is one of the ways in which I think Rogue One is an adaptation, not just in the sense of it's entering into this relationship with the other stories, but that it's kind of taking this and saying, I'm going to do something different, right? I'm going to, instead of just and this is, by the way, this seems to me largely what a lot of the later Star Wars stuff has been doing, right? Is say, like, instead of doing the thing that was done with, well, let's say extremely mixed success in the last three, in the episodes 7, 8, and 9, of like, let's continue the overall arc.
They're finding different ways to tell the story. Yeah.
To tell people's stories, right? They're focusing like, now let us tell you the story of the Mandalorian. Let's tell you the story of Cassian Andor, right? And how he got here, of Obi-Wan Kenobi, of Ahsoka, right? Of, there's all of these things that they're doing. And those are all kind of adaptations in the sense of like, we're maintaining the overall arc, and we're still in some sense trying to serve that overall arc and expand it in some ways, but not just re-entering that more, I'm about to say something that the English part of me cringes at, the more epic feel. Sorry, I cringe because people misuse the word epic all the time. Like medievalists, whenever the word epic is used in the press, like medievalists are always like, that's not epic. What the word epic means. But anyway,
but you're using it appropriately here in terms of the epic.
Exactly.
Yes, body of work. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think Phil's got a good point here too, that there's also a big, powerful element that we know this isn't going to end well. It's like watching Titanic, like we know how it's going to end, so therefore there's a different kind of investment, there's a different kind of understanding, because when we meet them at the beginning, we already know that this is going to be quite the journey that we're going to be on with them through the whole thing. And I've used that opening scene in film classes before just to kind of illustrate like how well this film establishes so much in that opening scene. Like, we have this engineer living as a farmer. So clearly he turned away from something that he didn't approve of. Like, that's intriguing. They know that they're being hunted. So as soon as something comes up, they have escape plans. They have planned.
The long-awaited day has finally arrived.
Right. There's something serious going on. They radio into their friend Saw Gerrera to be like, oh, okay, there's somebody elsewhere that's quite powerful that's keeping an eye on them, so they have interplanetary support. And then we have this baddie that just shoots whoever he wants and is just crass and kicks the dog left, right, and center. So it just so establishes these roles, these divisions, and these tensions in, about 6 minutes of screen time. It's brilliant. And it's really pretty. It's filmed in Iceland and just beautiful.
Yes.
I digress. But I do think there's something about the knowing where it's going to end, that you do have a different kind of investment, because we are watching the Star Wars films for their epic in that sense, for their epic engagement, that I'm here for 9 films. I'm here for the big picture. But Rogue One, you don't necessarily have to be.
Right. And there's something to be said also for, there is a kind of genre shift. Again, here's me applying terms which have definite meanings in classical and ancient usages, and have lost that to some extent. And yet, I still think it's relevant to say Rogue One's a tragedy. Like, it's going to end in sorrow, sorrow that brings hope, right? It's not a tragedy in the Shakespearean sense. Though don't get me started on that either. But anyway, it's the point is, this is very different from what we not only are set up do experience and are set up to experience, but then come to expect in the Star Wars films. I mean, if the original trilogy sort of defines this is what a Star Wars film is, then that's another way in which Rogue One is changing, is adapting things and saying, okay, let's do a Star Wars story. But instead of making it one where the scrappy underdogs succeed against all the odds,
And where it's very
survive,
focused on like the political tensions
yeah,
and
let's tell one in which the scrappy underdogs all die by the end of the film.
but also have such their own individual arcs and you know ways that they go from zero to hero. It's just brilliant. But yeah, they're not going to make it, and
Yeah,
they know it. Like there comes a certain point where they're like, "Let's go,"
yeah, yeah,
and that's incredibly powerful.
yeah, yeah. And and again, it's not only successful; it is setting out to do something else, something that is in fact quite different from what the other Star Wars films did. And of course, I mean, it's easy to kind of use this as a whipping boy. The films 7, 8, and 9, I mean, and this sort of the unsuccessfulness of those, though there are many things that I like about all three of them. But of course, I think about, when Force Awakens came out, right? And everybody was complaining about the way in which it was such an explicit recapitulation of the earlier story. I myself kind of liked that element of it, as I talked about at the time. I thought in some ways, I thought that was kind of fun. But it seems to me to emphasize the challenge which they perceived, but seemed to me not really to overcome, not really to surmount the challenge, is how do we do that again, right? How do we have, the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy both failed in different ways to achieve what the original trilogy achieved again. And while clearly both of them clearly feeling the pressure to try to do so. But I think, this other stuff, when they've taken to doing adaptations instead of trying to do that, right? Instead of trying to redo it, it's been so much more successful. We're not talking about The Mandalorian today, so I won't spend too much time on that. But again, that's another interesting illustration, which I bring up as a point of contrast with Rogue One, because one of the things that The Mandalorian does is change the story genre, right? It's like, hey, let's do Star Wars, but let's make it a Star Wars Western. Right. From the very first opening sequence of episode 1 of scene 1 in the saloon, right. With like that wonderful, music that accompanies the Mandalorian when he steps in through not the swinging doors, but anyway, like it's fun. Like it's playing on the Western genre from the very beginning.
Purposeful. Like this is exactly what they're trying to do. Like, yep, let's play.
Yeah.
Great.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Now, so in many ways, Rogue One it's not shifting genre like that. It's not being like, hey, let's do Star Wars, but let's make it a Western. Let's do Star Wars, but let's make it something else. The kind of genre, in a sense, is still sort of Star Wars genre, but that shift to the focus on the personal stories, like this is a story, this is the story about people, and its relationship to the larger story is it's not accidental, nor is it but it's secondary to the story of the people, and let's make it a story that is both about hope, that is like the New Hope origin story, right? Where does that new hope come from? Let's talk about the origin of hope, but let's tell that in a story that's going to be a tragedy in which everybody dies.
Right, and playing on that, rebellions are built on hope line is a really strong through line that's repeated from Cassian and then to Jin. And that's very powerful. Having that be the thread that goes into A New Hope when you know all those people died, that's a different kind of gravitas
Yeah.
to that line.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Absolutely. So anyhow, I thought that it was, this is why, like, the more I've thought about it, I'm like, yeah, Rogue One, totally an adaptation, and it really interested me, and it really kind of stretches my own definitions in some ways and helps me to see that a little bit differently. The ways in which they're playing off it, in some ways, of course, like their ability to make the people primary and the larger story secondary is built on the fact that we already know the primary story, like the overarching plot.
Already in it.
Yeah, we don't even have to be told that. And of course, if you see Rogue One in the context not only of the original trilogy but of the all the other stuff that's come around, I already, to cite one small thing. By the way, this is the first time I've seen Rogue One since I finished watching through Clone Wars and Rebels.
Okay.
And having done that, which means I now have all of this context for Saw Gerrera, which I had zero when I first saw the film when it came out.
Yeah.
I had no idea who the character Saw Gerrera was. It was a completely made up character to me
But
at the time.
didn't Saw Gerrera still make sense to you?
Did.
Yeah.
Was
Very
compelling. But now revisiting it with all of that, it also manages to put this, it's so cool because you could see the few lines that are there about how Saw Gerrera was a threat to the rebellion and how he was an extremist and caused the destruction of a great deal of like what the rebellion was trying to do. And of course, we get a bunch of those incidents told in the animated series that I was just describing, Rebels and Clone Wars. But of course, one of the things you can see in those earlier stories of Saw Gerrera is how they're like, you're fighting the Empire, but the way that you're doing this fight is not only like needlessly destructive and violent, like you're not only killing way more people than you need to kill innocent people, but you're also harming yourself. And then to see Saw Gerrera with his blasted body, there's not much of him left, as he says, right, and everything be like that.
And his like super budget version of the Darth Vader suit.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Like, he doesn't have the same tech.
Yeah, exactly. But the same problems, right?
Yep.
And anyway, you can see where his path has led him, and as you said, the clear similarities between, or the parallel, I guess perhaps I should say, between Saw Gerrera and Darth Vader, right? Like, what have you become? Like, where has your road led you here or there in the end?
I also love how this fits in as a standalone, but how much it still adds to films that were made 40 years before it. So like the fear of Darth Vader that we were talking about, but also the fear of the Death Star.
Yes.
Like the power of the bad guy is just obscene, and seeing it in this context when it's individual powerful men trying to outpower each other, it plays really well through individual characters, through this human story, but it's that power that persists into the other films.
Yes.
That's really cool and pretty rare.
I agree. The destruction of Jeddah City in Rogue One is, first of all, like, what an incredibly astounding visual marvel that is. Like the wave of rock coming up is just like, every time I'm
and
just
like that moment where the ship almost doesn't get out and
Yes.
you're like, they're gonna be like, it's so visceral, it's so powerful. And same visual effects, I'm going off on my tangent now, but when the Hammerhead ship smashes into the Star Destroyer and pushes it into the shield, just whew, there are certain scenes there that you just want to like stand up and cheer at the screen. It's amazing. But
Yeah.
I think those work so well though because they're also playing on our attachment to the humans. So that visual effect is so strong because we know that they have to get out if
Hmm.
we want anything, because they just heard the secret transmission. They just heard about this
Yeah.
flaw in the plan. Like they're the only ones that know they have to get out if we want this film to continue. We're only halfway through, you know?
Yeah.
So like tension, instant. And then we see the wave come. We know Saul's not gonna make it. Like, yeah, powerful.
No, it's really amazing, and it does. Just thinking back to your point about augmenting, our experience of the 40-year-old film, the Death Star, the real threat, the reality of the Death Star. It's a fascinating illustration because Alderaan floating around as space debris, right? When they show up to what they believe to be, what they expect to be, Alderaan, but it's not there, right? That's it's really evocative of the
Yeah.
imagination, but there is
But the
seeing
terror is
Jeddah City
gone.
struck, yeah,
Yeah. The terror is
is
over by the
yeah,
time we get to Alderaan.
yeah, and it works. Like Alderaan is, I mean, I don't want to knock it. What they do to leave it to our imagination there is really powerful, right? And the way in which, right, they're going to Alderaan, but instead of finding Alderaan, they find the Death Star instead, right? That's a really powerfully suggestive thing. Like in the place of Alderaan is the planetoid size spaceship that has just destroyed it, right? And that's it's very effective because it's not a criticism of the original film, but seeing the destruction of Jeddah City is it just adds an entirely new layer. There's this sense, especially throughout A New Hope, right? Like we never really see what the Death Star can do. It's left to our imaginations, which is
Yeah.
effective, but we don't actually experience it, right? We don't actually
Yeah.
see it, and so uh, even through the last, sequences as Luke is about to destroy the Death Star, right? Um, it we're still just, it's our own imaginations, like what is going to happen when the Death Star fires. Anyway, so yeah, I thought that was really powerful.
I think that's a huge, yeah, that's a huge element of it. That it's not just the visual wow that we can have with a modern film. 2016, we had a very different tech than we
Hmm.
did. And I missed some of it, to be honest. There are too many lasers in 2016 Rogue One for me. Like every
Hmm.
time a ship gets shot, there's just blue lasers all over it and static electricity that I'm like, no. But in terms of the devastation that we can visualize that we weren't necessarily able to, or just
Yeah,
it wasn't part of the focus in the 70s, it was just epic.
yeah,
Yeah. Jeddah City, I also absolutely loved that for the melee of people that we got to see, the different beings from different planets and different films and different characters. Like there was I forget what they're called from Hoth, one of the big backpack guys.
oh yeah,
Um,
yeah. I don't
just one of
remember
them
that.
walking around.
Yeah.
And that's when we have our first introduction to the Jedi that were, and watching, blanking on his name too, watching him fight.
Chirrut?
Yeah, Trim.
Yeah.
Watching him fight without a lightsaber was one of the most incredible scenes. The first time that happened, and then you discover he's blind, or maybe I did it the other way around, but it was just so impactful to me that, like, again, I'm attached to this human, I'm attached to this character, and then seeing the power and the skill that he's able to wield, that was way more impressive to me than the ability to control the Force or hold a lightsaber. And it
Yes.
just continues. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And sorry, just to clarify, JJ was asking, is it, yes, I know I'm talking about seeing it from the ground. What we don't see is what it is like to be on the business end of the Death Star. Watching a ball blow up from a distance it's not quite, it doesn't feel real.
Yeah.
Nothing like in the same way, that the same kind of perspective that we get. It's that shifting around of perspective to be on the planet. And I know it's a minor blast, right? They didn't blow up the whole moon of Jeddah on purpose, right? And everything. But anyway, but back to the point that you're making about Chura. I
I
love
love
that character.
I want another film of Chura and his buddy. Like
Yes.
they're a different breed. That's a story I need to know because where were you from? Like what culture and community is that? I assume there's either camaraderie of brotherhood there or a love interest. I'm not sure, but the dedication the two of them have to each other is so profound and so incredible that again, it's that human story that's bringing me into this world.
Yeah.
But the world fits in perfectly with what I need it to be in a Star Wars film.
Yeah. And yet that's the element of all of the parts of the story. That's the one that I felt was most explicitly supplementing the Star Wars story that I knew or thought that I knew. Star Wars, the original films, and frankly, most of the rest of the films seem to me to present the Force as a kind of like binary thing. Like either you're a Jedi / Sith or you're not. Like, either you have access to the
You use the
Force
Force or you don't.
or you don't, right? You're just a normal person, right? I mean, it's not exactly the same as, but it's almost like wizards and muggles, right? Like everybody who is not a wizard is just a muggle, as far as the Force is concerned, right? In the original Star Wars films. And even the way in which it's talked about, like I think about the Han Solo's comments, right? About, this sort of jaunty skepticism, right? That he expresses when he first is, has Obi-Wan and Luke on board, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, Chirrut represents this. He's middle ground. He's not a Jedi.
Yeah.
He's not a Jedi, but he's obviously not normal either.
Right.
Like, and what's abnormal about him, what he continually emphasizes, is not that he is gifted in some way, but that he trusts in the Force.
Yeah.
Right? It's his relationship with the Force, not the Force's relationship with him, in a sense, which separates him from other people. And I think that that's a really, I think that is to me, if there is a gap, not just a narrative gap that they're filling in this story, if there was something which really fills kind of a gap in my imagination about how this Star Wars universe works, it was him. And that's one of the things that makes me want to see more of that. I'm like, yeah, okay, great. So
Yeah.
there is something between, like, the Force, the Jedi talk like, oh, the Force is in everything, right? But only, the 1% have access to it, apparently, right? And yet now here we get this wider sense. If it's true that the Force is out around and filling everything, then what does that mean to your average person on the average day? What were they worshiping? What were they teaching at these Jedi temples and things?
Yeah.
And that's what we got,
and
the remnants of in Jeddah City.
And we talk about world building all the time. Like that is such just a beautiful example of it because I want to know, where did he learn that? What was his household like? Where was he born? What was his schooling? Like with one scene, you just have this incredible introduction to this character that I want to know so much more. That I hope we get a spin-off one day, but I don't know about that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I agree. That's the element of the story that I
Mm-hmm.
find really fascinating from that kind of again, it's a sort of a broader world building sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. But I did find it enriching in a way that, I mean, of course, you know, you and I are both old enough to remember the like enormous disappointment with which the whole midichlorian count thing in the prequels was greeted by fandom. Everyone hated that when that first came
I mean,
out.
and that this is showing the difference in our ages. I was 18 when
Yeah,
that came out, so
right.
I was still in high school and had not started on any of this academic exploration. I was just a Star Wars fan and still thought that was dumb.
Right, right. Now, I will say, as they've owned it, I've come to like. Uh, so, for instance, when they're doing midichlorian testing in like season, what was it, season 3? What was the last season of the Bad Batch? Anyway, the final season of the Bad Batch,
Mhm.
which again I just watched relatively recently. When they're talking about like measuring midichlorian levels and stuff like that, I'm not cringing anymore. Like I'm like, okay, like they're leaning into it. It's part of the lore now. It's part of the world. But I don't love it. I still don't absolutely love it. But the point is, that was an attempt in the prequels to do
Yeah.
this, to sort of fill in a world building gap, right? Let us give you more about how the Force works and where Jedi powers come from. But it was not successful, right? It was not successful, and because people felt like it was like, great, so now you've just ruined the magic, you've ruined the mystery of it. What seemed was what I recall most people saying and feeling at the time. But this just created, in a sense, created mystery, but gave us a glimpse into something that I felt like a middle term that I felt needed to be there, right? That like the way they talked about the Force. Again, to you, I was comparing Jedi and normal people to wizards and muggles, right? In J.K. Rowling's world, it's really clear. There's like the people who have it and the people who don't. Like there's no
Yeah.
sense that there's a middle term. That there's some people who are just like kind of magical, right? It's like you're
Well, there's the squibs, but that's not helpful either. If like
no,
you don't have it, we're just
no.
gonna make
They're
fun
just
of you.
people
Like,
who right
no.
who know about the
Yeah.
one world and who are related
You don't
physically,
get it. Yeah.
genetically to people in that world, but they don't have it, right? Yeah.
Right.
Um, but again, there isn't any sense of like a true middle term of people who are kind of magical or people who are whatever. In Star Wars, the way they talked about the Force, you felt like that should exist, right? Like
Yeah.
there should be a gradient between, normal person and Jedi, and so I really
Yeah, I liked
yeah.
seeing that living example of it. And, even just the necklace around her neck, like just these little elements of believing the force, it felt much more living and part of their daily life than
Hmm.
this unreachable magical thing.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, it was that I think it's a fascinating part of the film, definitely.
Hmm.
And I mean, remember seeing this film in the theater, and that was my favorite part. Let's talk about the droid a little
Oh,
bit.
K2SO, I love you.
K2SO. So K2SO
Who's
is,
apparently going to feature in Andor season 2.
I was hoping Andor was going to get around to. Now again, there's another fascinating example, right, of now Andor, the show, being an adaptation of Rogue One, right?
Right.
Which is really fun and
Which is
really
really
cool.
fun.
Like, how
Yeah.
do we get to, thinking of Cashin's speeches about like the things that
Growing up
he's
in a war
done?
zone.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, to
I've
get
been fighting since I was 8 or whatever age. Yeah.
to get an origin story and to see how all that. Anyway, I think that's again that's really fun. And so I would certainly, no, not hoping, trusting that K2SO and his relationship with Cashin was going to be brought in. It's going to be in season 2.
That apparently.
Do you know if season 2 is meant to be the final season of Andor?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody will correct me, but I mean, I've only watched the trailer twice, but I'm pretty sure those are the rumors I've heard so far.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so, but now
that's also cool, because that means by the end of season 2 of Andor, we might have a Cassian that steps into Rogue One. Like, that's
Yeah.
where it's going to take us up to.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, exactly. So K2SO. K2SO,
Is bloody brilliant.
yes, which is kind of remarkable because of again, there's a lot of pressure, right? Just like there's a even more pressure on BB-8, right? Because BB-8 was so manifestly filling the R2-D2 slot, right? I mean, even to be vaguely shaped like R2-D2 and anyway, whatever. But you've got the beloved droids, R2-D2 and C-3PO, and you've got beloved droid sidekick, right? The kind of pressure that brings in to a film like this, when you're like, okay, he's going to have a droid sidekick, so it has to be like this will fail if he's not a beloved droid sidekick, right? Like that's, I mean, there's the success of the droid characters in the original Star Wars series puts so much pressure on droid characters, in all of the rest of the
I didn't feel
Star
pressure, I
Wars.
guess, but I mean, you saying that makes a lot of sense to me. I didn't clock that there would be pressure, but yeah, there is, I suppose, an expectation that these guys have to deliver. Like, they're not just functional narrative devices; they're actual, like, buddies and personalities. And how many personalities can you give robots that are different? And the answer is quite a few. We've met quite a few different robots.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, we're not talking about the Mandalorian today, but the Mandalorian's relationship with droids is a really interesting play in this. From the beginning of season 1 through the end of season 3 so far, has been a really interesting subplot of the whole thing. But K2SO. K2SO is in a little bit more, I mean, we get 2 droid models in the original Star Wars series, right? We've got the R2-D2 template and the C-3PO template, right? One is humanoid, speaks human languages, or speaks, all of the languages, right? C-3PO does. They're all like a second language to him. It was funny. I was in, I got to get to, this has been a big week for Star Wars adaptations for me. It's one of the reasons I was excited to switch to talking about Rogue One today, because I just went to Galaxy's Edge in Walt Disney World.
What? How did you not tell me that?
Yeah, that happened on Tuesday last week. Yeah.
What color is your lightsaber?
I didn't get a lightsaber though. Actually, color lightsaber was one of by far my favorite ride on Galaxy's Edge, which is the Rise of the Resistance, which is a delightfully immersive ride in the middle of which you actually get captured by the First Order and like marched in and lined up for interrogation by Disney employees who I think have the best job.
Yeah.
Because they get to like be snarky and abusive to the tourists all day, because like they're lining them up and bringing them in for interrogation. And so I went on this ride twice, and on the second time through the ride, Matthias and I were lined up, and a guy in front of us had a lightsaber, and the First Order captain who was lining us up, looks at him, he kind of rolls his eyes, and he's like, let's see it. What color is it? And he turns on the lightsaber, and it's purple. And the guy rolls his eyes and says, somehow that makes it even worse. Anyway,
and it wouldn't have mattered
hilarious.
what color it was. The guy would have said that.
Yeah, exactly. It was great.
That's
It was
awesome.
great. Yeah.
Oh God. Well, I mean, yeah, taking this into a discussion of rides is a whole different
Yes.
topic.
Well, and I was thinking about, you and our viewers. I was thinking about Other Minds and Hands throughout that ride, because that ride was one of the greatest, like, adaptation experiences. Yeah, it was so
totally.
good. It was so good.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked about rides at all, but like taking adaptation into a actual experience that you step into next
Yeah.
level, like what fun to build the world that somebody gets to participate in.
Yes.
And interactive theater is another one I would love to talk about. Like secret cinema is a big thing over in the UK, where you buy a ticket to this secret movie screening and you don't know what it is, but you get clues sent to you. So I bought a ticket, and it was in London. I went with 6 friends, and then I got my role, and then I got my costume directive, and then it was slowly being revealed to me that I was going to be in a Star Wars something. And I was a merchant. And so for like 2 hours before the film screening, you have tasks and you have a duty, and there's also a snack bar because it's, an entertainment venue. And then you all watch the film while stormtroopers are running in and out. So like participating in the story while then screening a film, that's next level, guys. Anyway, so we'll save that for another day. So K2SO.
K2SO. So I was saying, he's, on the one hand, evoking the C-3PO template, right?
Yeah.
In that he was humanoid, and of course, one of the things that was established clearly earlier on from C-3PO and R2-D2, there's one that's shaped like a person, and there's one that's not shaped like a person. And the one that's not shaped like a person is one who acts like a person, and the one who is shaped like a person is the one that sounds like an alien and a robot.
Yeah.
Right. The one who is like least in touch with human emotion and things. R2-D2 has no problem with understanding human emotion. C-3PO doesn't always get it, but R2 always gets it. Right. So K2SO was in the C-3PO category. There's like a kind of a disjunction between him and everybody else, in the sense of like understanding and feeling what's going on here, not getting why they should do some things or why some things were good ideas, or always wanting to cite the odds, and Cashin telling him not to, and all these things.
Really bad. It's really bad.
It's really bad. Really, they're high. It's high, very high.
So good. And even his gestures, it's like, it's high. Really high.
Yes.
Like, to get that kind of snark in a droid is, and I do wonder, like, I would love to know the production process of, would it have been as good if it wasn't Alan Tudyk? How much did Alan Tudyk bring into the role? Did he shoot first and then animated, or did he do the voice to where the K2SO was already built? Like, just that whole process was pretty magical to me.
Yeah. The delivery is pretty, and of course that's, by saying he's in the C-3PO model, it doesn't mean he's C-3PO, right? C-3PO
Right.
is never snarky. Like, that's not,
He doesn't get it.
no, he doesn't get it enough. K2SO is way more sophisticated in that sense. He's not just,
So do you think K2SO like combines R2D2 and
well,
C3PO?
in some ways, but I think that the sarcasm of K2SO seems to me to be unique. Like, we don't get that edge in any of the droids that, in either one of our 2 main droids, right, in the original trilogy. Even when he's like, yes, it obviously would have been best for me to stay back with the ship, right? So many moments when he's, I did, but that was boring, right? His
Snarky teenager. Yeah.
yeah, and of course, all of this in the context, which is a very different context from the droids that we got in the original trilogy, which is that he's a reprogrammed Imperial droid.
Yeah.
Right? So he is somebody, what we're hearing is not his original personality. He is someone who has been taken over. Like he's had his own programming wiped and he's been reprogrammed. And the result is this like ill-adjusted, sarcastic, character.
Teenager, really.
Yeah.
That's
Which is
surely that he didn't get a shooter and
yeah, which is really fascinating, I think. Now, Ms. Manrique maintains that R2D2 is snarky. We just don't understand it.
that's entirely possible.
Very, very possible. Very possible. Yeah.
But being able to pull it off in one droid is pretty great. And the relationship between them too, like it doesn't feel like commander and servant that you would think a droid would be. It does feel like buddy buddy and like, come on, dude, like get with the program, stay here, do that. And he's just a snarky teenager.
Yeah. It was interesting because they gave him such a different kind of personality. Certainly, again, although he is, I would still maintain C-3PO mode, right? C-3PO model. They made his personality so different from C-3PO's. But it's, yes, I agree. Gregory Simonson, he's been given a genuine people personality. Yes. And yes, I get the Douglas Adams reference there. But yeah, and that's, I don't know. It's a kind of risk that they took with K2SO's character. There was a risk that he would not have ended up feeling droidy enough, like too human, to be, that it could have sort of broken the frame, right? And yet it ends up working so well. And instead, especially with his nature as a reprogrammed Imperial droid, this is like the thing I kept coming back to. There's a sense in which he's a victim of violence.
Yeah.
Like you could look at it from one of two very different angles. You could say he was like kidnapped and brainwashed and made to serve the rebellion, right?
And now also and also still looks like this monster that he was. Like there is a certain amount of trauma kind of in play with him, and when he's mistaken as one, he's not very good at, he's not comfortable in that role. He doesn't know what to do.
Right.
And like that panic is so human that it's hard to not relate to him.
Yes. And that moment when Jin blows away the other robot and then he sticks his head around the corner and says, "How did you know
knew
that wasn't me?" Right. Yeah, exactly.
Of course.
But so again, you could look at it from the perspective that he is a victim of violence and he's been brainwashed to serve the Republic. But you could also look at it as as a slave set free, that he, and that I think is much more, feels much more like what the situation that we're given, and certainly what seems to be a genuine friendship between him and Cassian. But and even that marvelous acceptance of Jin at the end, his final exchange with Jin before she goes into the vault.
Yeah, and it's making me think of just kind of like the theme of sacrifice too, because obviously this film is entirely a sacrifice, that they all gave their lives to get this information. But there's individual sacrifices that I found really incredible, and I think K2SO's is probably my favorite, that he didn't have anything to gain from this fight. He is a droid, like he didn't have literally any skin in this game.
Right.
But he sacrificed everything in order to save these guys so they could fulfill, because they were important to him. So I don't know whether the actual battle was important to K2SO, but those humans were important to him, and he decided to sacrifice himself for it. Like, that's huge.
Yeah. Yes, and there's something about his the evocative moment when he locks the vault door, right? Which, I mean, he seals it and locks it completely. But that moment when Jin and Cashin are in there trying to work it out, right? And the stormtroopers start coming in, and he just closes the door behind them without telling them anything or saying anything about it.
No discussion.
And they just kind of look around behind them at the door that just closed. And anyway, it's the resolution of his, the amount of resolution that he shows in his stand, and the deliberateness of his sacrifice in order to give them time. I mean, the others, of course, I mean, everybody sacrifices themselves eventually, but there is something more. There is something more kind of deliberate. Like, the others are putting themselves at risk, and know that sooner or later they're going to die, right? But that's not quite the same thing as, I'm going to lock the door and I'm going to stand in front of it and I'm going to hold them off until they kill me.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like, can you chalk that down to programming? It doesn't feel like it.
No.
And it's that humanization side of it that makes it so functional. That, yeah, you could argue that's his programming, that's what he's supposed to do, but it doesn't feel that way. So that works.
Yeah, I mean, K2SO's character in some ways seems to me to be, he's almost like a picture of, not a picture, that's not exactly the right metaphor or simile. I said like, he's, what I'm trying to get at is, Jyn Erso's story, in part, is about her own discovery of the rebellion, right? I think about the thing that she says when they're talking about, like, how can you, like, live with the banner of the Empire, and she says, it doesn't matter if you don't look up, right? And it's like the rough life that she has lived as part of Saw Gerrera's, she was raised within the rebellion, and yet her, well, like within his version of the rebellion, but her devotion is, she's not devoted to the rebellion, right? She's just, looking out for herself. And so there is, and of course, this is sort of traced with the hope motif, when Cashin first tells her that rebellions are built on hope, and but the hope for what? Like, why is a rebellion worth fighting for? Is it just because the Empire is awful? Like, what is the positive thing? And even there, it's a part of the story that's easy to lose sight of. Like, yes, the evil dictator should be opposed, but, like, to what end? Like,
right, why?
Are things going to get better? Like, are we just replacing the dictator with a different dictator? K2SO, I think, is the really kind of understated part of the story that gives us a glimpse into that even gives Jyn a glimpse into that. Because K2SO, he was somebody who was dominated by the Empire, right? He was an expression of the Empire, and now he's been reprogrammed by the Republic. But instead of being like, a stone cold robotic killer for the Empire, and now he's a stone cold robotic killer for the Rebellion, when he shifts from Empire to Rebellion, he becomes a person. He is freed to make choices on his own. His sacrifice at the end is like the final affirmation of what, like, he doesn't only have the freedom to die for what he believes in. It shows why they believe in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's reminding me kind of Finn's story. He was a stormtrooper that was brainwashed, but once he got the conch on the head, it all came back to his normal life. Like, that's kind of the feeling I'm getting from this version of K2SO that you're describing, that he was programmed to be an Imperial droid, but as soon as he got the conch on the head, he had free will and became himself again, as if there is a himself that a droid can have. Like, His
Right.
default is this individual. Like, are they? Do they? And I love that thought process that that's making us do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like he has free will. He has made the choice to be part of this organization and this group, and we love him for it.
Yeah. JJ was saying Fallout directly addresses the philosophical question of the differences between androids and people. Star Wars makes you feel like a walking battery as family.
Yeah.
It's true. Star Wars invites you never to ask the question. Like, you are actively invited to never ask the question, why do droids have personalities? Why should they have personalities? Like, what you assume you treat almost like every mobile piece of technology, like anything that moves under its own power, you are invited to treat it as like an individual with free will, or
Servant.
it should be an individual with free will, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Anyway, so it is a really interesting element of the Star Wars sort of world
World.
there, not thinking about programming and reprogramming, because he's not just been K2SO hasn't just been unprogrammed, he's been reprogrammed, right?
Right.
And yet his whole, the expression in a sense of his reprogramming appears to be free will.
And that moment where he's caught and they're like, we need to look at your programming, there's a moment of panic that we're going to lose him. Like, he's going to go back to their version. I don't want that guy. No.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a real fear there.
Yeah. Yeah. I love what you said about his showing not only incompetence but discomfort with imitating an imperial droid. I mean, like, I love his, like, I am taking these prisoners to imprison them
To
in prison.
prison.
Yes.
And Cassian just looking at him like, please, dude, come up with a better story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
it was a great exchange.
yeah. But because again, like, he can't even fake it. He doesn't even know how to pretend to be an imperial
Yeah.
droid anymore. Um, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, it's an interesting element. It's one of the things, I don't know that we talked about this before in our visions discussion when we were trying to figure out what makes Star Wars, but I think that's one of the things, like, that everything that talks and moves on its own, like any piece of machinery that talks and moves on its own, is treated as if it has free will and a personality.
Has an individual personality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you might be right.
I mean, that's very characteristic of Star Wars and very unusual. Like, it's,
Yeah.
one would not make the same. I mean, I never, like, Star Trek people never treat their tricorders like pets.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it just doesn't happen.
They don't move though.
What?
They
Well,
don't move though.
they don't move. They don't move on their own. It's true. It's true.
Yeah. But yeah, that's an interesting distinction. I mean, like, obviously there's a lot of ththings that move in Star Wars, but I'm thinking like vehicles, but that's driven by a human. So if it moves independently,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, obviously, with in the Star Trek world, you have Data and the android question, and they're very interested in the next generation, extremely interested in that question of where
Yeah.
the boundaries lie, and that's a question that show engages with very actively and very interestingly in a lot of ways.
Mm,
Star Wars is almost interesting for the way in which it refuses to
doesn't,
engage with this
yeah.
question.
Yeah, that this is just the way it is.
Right.
This is the way.
In almost exactly the same way that we're asked to, like when we first see, I don't remember, it is probably a thing and I just don't remember it, but like when Jin is in prison at the beginning and we hear the sound of the snoring of her cellmate off camera, and then we look over and her snoring cellmate is this vaguely humanoid alien creature with a tentacular face, right? Which I don't remember seeing a creature like that in other Star Wars films. People who know them better than I may remember that, but I don't. And we never see him again. We never know who he is, right? It's a totally
Don't know his crime.
unimportant
Yeah.
character. But these kinds of, the way in which we are expected to accept like alien shaped, weirdness and stuff, and just like, it's like, oh, they're They're all just people like everybody else. Droids all seem to fit into that category, essentially, like in Star Wars. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
Um,
I want to just keep going, but I'm also like, we are at 11.
yeah, we are at 11. We should
Or
stop.
6.
Or 6. Yeah.
But
exactly.
I do feel like this is such an ongoing conversation, especially as we get Andor and rework our definition as a collective in Other Minds and Hands for adaptation. Star Wars is such a good vehicle to kind of explore that.
Yeah.
And there's still so much. I mean, I haven't seen the Ashoka series. I haven't seen Clone Wars. Like, there's still so much that like you can engage with, even as a Star Wars fan. That we got to keep playing.
Yeah, Clone Wars in particular is, I mean, the challenge that show undertakes, and in my opinion, succeeds in to a very remarkable degree, is to retroactively make Revenge of the Sith into a good movie. Like, it's incredible. It's incredible what they do to, it's, very, very, very powerful.
And how cool is that? Just for something to give more power to something that's already made. You know, like Rogue One giving power to the original 70s and 80s trilogy because it shows us the depth of the fear. Like, what? That's awesome.
Oh man, there is so much that I never thought from the first handful of episodes of Clone Wars that I watched that it was going to become what it did. Like, what it becomes over the course of 7 seasons, I think, is quite remarkable. I mean, it's
I mean, we've got what, year and a half at least until the next season of Rings of Power. I guess I can dig in.
Yeah, it's worth it. It's worth it. Yeah, it's worth it. I'm at some point I will go back and do a whole chronological rewatch.
I would love to do that.
You know, that's fun. But yeah, I agree with JJ that Clone Wars and Bad Batch are must watches. They're really good. Bad Batch, I think, is fascinating as well. Did finally get to the end of that. Yeah, and it ended like, I've come to love series that are brave enough to end, like actually, and not just go on until they're finally canceled, but actually end. Tell a narrative with an end point. So good.
Limited series, like when you know what your arc is going to look like and you've set it out ahead of time.
Yep.
Yeah.
This is what I'm sort of hoping for, looking forward to, with Rings of Power.
Andor.
Well, no, with Rings of Power, and I am looking forward to the end of the Andor series, because that one has to have an end, right? I mean, Andor's life can't be infinite in between his origin and his end. We already have his end, so
we know his end.
Yeah, so he's got his story has a port it has to feed into, right? In Rogue One.
Well, he still looks this way.
Yeah, exactly right. It's obviously not 30 years, right? But anyway, yeah. The Rings of Power creates this really interesting thing. I mean, it's my favorite kind of television. I like just kind of like open episodic TV shows that can go on for many years. Like, that's fun. And
but
that's
the well thought out, structured. Yeah.
That's what we kind of thought we might be getting when, like Tolkien TV adaptations were, the guess, I remember making it myself many, many years ago, like, we're probably going to get the adventures of young Aragorn, right, which can go on for an almost indefinite period of time, and we still may get that. But I am delighted that instead of just doing an open-ended thing, the thing that they're doing is a story. So yeah.
Did you ever watch the BBC Sherlock, the Benedict Cumberbatch ones?
Yeah.
That would be a fun one for us to discuss too.
It would be.
Because that was one of the first limited series I engaged with, where like each episode stood on its own, but they wove together such a lovely story. And there was only 3 episodes per season or something. It was very tight.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's very interesting. And of course, that's also an adaptation in a double sense, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a yeah. I know that series pretty well.
And then Elementary came out at the same time. I never watched that one, but that came out at the same
Yeah,
time.
I
So
didn't
having
either watch that one.
two
Yeah,
Sherlock adaptations out. But
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
All right, so we'll come back to Star Wars, but we'll move back to Narnia next week.
Yep. Yeah. Let's do Prince Caspian,
Caspian.
to continue the go back to and continue the Narnia discussion, and then we will move forward. I'll need to rewatch some of the Anne of Green Gables. Some of the Anne of Green Gables is. I'm pretty fresh on the book, but
I'm like, which Anne? Because there's Anne with an E, and there's the original. Like,
I think both, right? I think
I
we
kind of want to talk about
like
both.
with Narnia,
Yeah.
we do like the
Yeah.
canonical Anne of Green Gables adaptation, and then
Yeah.
we do with the actress who's escaping me. Anyway, the canonical one,
Yep.
and then the Anne with an E, the recent Netflix one. Yeah,
I can't remember her name either, but I just saw that she's going to be involved in a new Anne of Green Gables adaptation playing
is she gonna play
an older character.
Marilla in the
I don't know if it was Marilla. I think it was somebody else.
Okay,
I'll have to, yeah,
interesting.
all snippets of news I was reading. So maybe we'll discuss it, but for those we'll do both, and maybe we do openings or something like that again to have like a snippet to dive into.
Yeah, yeah, yep. We'll get there.
Okay.
We'll get there.
So Narnia next week. Sounds
Narnia
good.
next week. Okay, very good.
See you guys.
Bye now.